Deuteronomy and Luke might seem like they come from two very different worlds, and in many ways, they do. Deuteronomy is one of the first 5 books of the Bible, what Jewish people call the Torah, or the Law. It contains the final speeches of Moses to the people of Israel, just before they enter the Promised Land. It's full of instructions, rules, and reminders about how to live as God's special people. It speaks of building a society that is fair, just, and holy. The book looks back at the journey from slavery in Egypt, and looks forward to a new life in a new land, a life that should reflect God's own goodness and justice. On the other hand, the Gospel of Luke is found in the New Testament. It tells the story of Jesus of Nazareth, his birth, his life, his teachings, his death, and his resurrection. Luke was a careful historian, a doctor who wanted to give a full and orderly account of the events that had changed the world forever. His writing is filled with stories of hope, healing, and forgiveness. He shows a special concern for the poor, the outsiders, and those who were often forgotten by society. Luke's story isn't just about one man, it's about God's long-awaited plan to rescue and renew the whole world, starting with his own people, Israel. So what could these two books possibly have to say to each other? It's a bit like looking at the blueprints for a house, and then looking at the finished home, fully built and lived in. Deuteronomy gives us the blueprints, the foundational principles for what a God-honoring community should look like. It lays out the dream of a world where people care for one another and live in right relationship with God. Luke, in telling the story of Jesus, shows us how that dream begins to come true in a surprising and wonderful way. He shows us the living embodiment of God's law of love. As we journey through these texts, we will see that the same God is at work in both. The God who gave Israel rules about kindness to their neighbors is the same God who sent an angel to an old priest and a young girl with a message of incredible hope. The deep desire for justice, compassion, and community that we find in the ancient laws of Deuteronomy finds its ultimate fulfillment in the miraculous events of Luke's Gospel. It's one single sweeping story of God's faithful love for his people and his world, a story that continues to invite us in today. Deuteronomy chapter 22 dives right into the practical, everyday details of life in ancient Israel. It's not a book of abstract ideas, it's a guidebook for how to live together as a community that honors God. The chapter begins with a very simple yet profound instruction. If you see your neighbor's ox or sheep wandering off, you must not ignore it. You are to take it and return it to its owner. Even if you don't know the owner, you are to care for the animal until they come looking for it. This is a law about responsibility. It says that you are your brother's keeper, and your neighbor's problems are also your concern. The rules continue with a focus on human dignity and respect. There are laws about clothing, making a distinction between men and women in a way that maintained social order and identity in that culture. Then, the chapter speaks about kindness even to the smallest of creatures. If you find a bird's nest with a mother bird sitting on her young or her eggs, you are not to take the mother along with the young. You must let the mother go. This small act of compassion shows a deep respect for life and for the natural world that God has created. It teaches the people to be gentle and not greedy, to think about the future and not just their immediate gain. Another important set of rules in this chapter concerns building a safe home. When you build a new house, you must build a parapet, which is a small wall, around the edge of your flat roof. In that culture, roofs were used as an extra room for socializing or sleeping, so this was a vital safety measure. This law prevented people from accidentally falling off. It was a practical way of showing that you are responsible for the safety of your family and your guests. It's a law that says, your actions, even in building your own home, affect the well-being of others. It is a law about loving your neighbor in a very real and tangible way. Finally, the chapter addresses issues of purity and right relationships, particularly within marriage. It contains serious rules designed to protect the integrity of the family and to ensure justice and fairness when accusations were made. These laws, while they may seem harsh to us today, were intended to create stability and trust within the most fundamental unit of society. They underscore the importance of truthfulness, the protection of the vulnerable, and the sanctity of the commitments people make to one another. Every rule, from returning a lost sheep to building a safe roof, was about creating a community defined by care, respect, and justice. At first glance, These rules in Deuteronomy might seem like a random collection of do's and don'ts. Why would God be so concerned with a lost donkey or a wall on a roof? But when we look closer, we see a beautiful and coherent vision for society. These rules mattered because they were training wheels for love. They were teaching the people of Israel, who had just spent 400 years as slaves in Egypt, how to live as free people who cared for one another. In Egypt, they were treated as objects used and abused. Now, God was teaching them to see the value and dignity in every person and even in every creature. These laws were about building a community that looked different from all the nations around them. In many ancient societies, the rule was might makes right. The powerful could take what they wanted, and the weak had no protection. But God was calling Israel to be a different kind of people. In God's kingdom, justice meant protecting the vulnerable. Returning a lost animal wasn't just about property, it was about protecting your neighbor's livelihood. Building a parapet on your roof wasn't just a building code, it was a public declaration that you valued human life above convenience. These were daily practices that shaped the heart of the nation. Furthermore, these rules were a constant reminder of who God is. The God of Israel is a God of order, not chaos, of compassion, not cruelty, of justice, not oppression. By following these laws, the people were acting out the character of their God in their daily lives. When they showed kindness to a mother bird, they were reflecting the Creator's care for His creation. When they ensured a fair hearing for someone who was accused, they were reflecting God's own perfect justice. The law wasn't just a set of rules to earn God's favor, it was a gift, a way for the people to become more like the God who had rescued and loved them. Ultimately, these regulations were about creating a holy people. Holiness doesn't just mean being morally perfect or spending all day in prayer. In the Bible, it means being set apart for a special purpose. Israel was set apart to be a light to the nations, to show the world what it looks like when a community lives under the good and loving rule of God. These practical, down-to-earth laws about everyday life were the building blocks of that holiness. They were how Israel was meant to put God's love on display for all the world to see, creating a society where everyone, from the most powerful leader to the humblest farmer, was treated with dignity and care. After focusing on daily life within the community in chapter 22, Deuteronomy chapter 23 turns its attention to the boundaries of the community. It addresses the question, who can be a full member of the assembly of the Lord? This might sound exclusive or unwelcoming to our modern ears, but for ancient Israel, defining the community was a matter of survival and identity. The chapter lists certain individuals who were excluded from full participation in Israel's formal worship assembly. These exclusions were not based on personal dislike, but on historical and symbolic reasons that were deeply meaningful at the time. For example, the chapter states that Ammonites and Moabites were not to be admitted into the assembly. The reason given is rooted in history. When the Israelites were wandering in the desert after escaping from Egypt, these nations did not show them hospitality. They refused to provide them with food and water. Even more seriously, they hired a prophet named Balaam to curse Israel. This historical act of hostility was remembered, and the exclusion served as a powerful reminder of the importance of loyalty to God's people, and the serious consequences of opposing God's purposes. It was a lesson about the corporate memory of the people. The chapter also includes rules about maintaining the camp's physical and spiritual purity, especially during times of war. Soldiers were instructed to keep the camp clean, even requiring them to go outside the camp for bodily functions and to carry a tool for digging. This might seem like a simple matter of hygiene, but it was connected to a profound spiritual idea. For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you. The camp was not just a military base, it was a sacred space where God was present. Physical cleanliness was an outward sign of the inner holiness and readiness required of those who fought in God's name. However, the chapter is not only about exclusion, it also provides pathways for inclusion. It makes a clear distinction, for instance, with Edomites and Egyptians. The Edomites were to be welcomed because they were considered relatives of Israel, descended from Esau, Jacob's brother, and the Egyptians, despite having enslaved Israel, were also to be treated with a degree of openness. The third generation of Egyptians living among the Israelites could be admitted to the assembly. This rule shows a remarkable capacity for forgiveness and forward thinking, acknowledging that the sins of the past should not forever define future relationships. It shows that the boundaries, while firm, were not entirely uncrossable. The rules of exclusion and inclusion in Deuteronomy chapter 23 can be, well, pretty difficult for us to understand today. Why would a loving God command his people to exclude anyone? The key to understanding these laws is really the concept of holiness. Israel was called to be a nation set apart by God, to be a special reflection of his character to the world. These boundary lines were not about creating some kind of social club of elites. Rather, they were about protecting the unique identity and mission of the nation. The community was supposed to be a space where God's values, justice, faithfulness, and mercy were upheld, in stark contrast to the often brutal and idolatrous practices of surrounding cultures. The boundary served as a strong teaching tool. By excluding those who represented historical hostility, like the Ammonites and Moabites, the law reminded every generation of the importance of faithfulness to God and his covenant people. It taught them that actions have long-term consequences, and that a community built on God's promises must protect itself from influences that would seek to undermine it. These rules were a shield, designed to preserve the spiritual health and integrity of a people who were entrusted with carrying God's message of salvation for the entire world. It was about keeping the light of the nation from being extinguished. Yet within these firm boundaries there was also a radical message of potential welcome. The law that allowed for the inclusion of Egyptians after 3 generations is, honestly, pretty astonishing. Israel had been a nation of slaves under Egyptian rule for centuries. Human nature would be to hold a grudge forever, but the law commanded Israel to move beyond that history. It taught them that even their former oppressors could, in time, become part of the family of God. This points to a God whose ultimate desire is not to exclude, but to bring people in, even those from whom we would least expect it. This tension between boundaries and welcome is really central to the biblical story. The community needed to be clearly defined to preserve its unique calling, but it was never meant to be a fortress with the doors permanently locked. It was meant to be a holy space that could, in time, attract and welcome others into the blessing of knowing God. These laws in Deuteronomy, in their own ancient way, were preparing the ground for a future time when the boundaries would be redrawn in a surprising and beautiful way, a future that begins to unfold in a powerful way in the pages of Luke's Gospel. Centuries after Moses gave the law, we open the Gospel of Luke and find ourselves back in the land of Israel. The people are living under the rule of another great empire, Rome. Many were wondering if God had forgotten his promises. It is in this atmosphere of waiting and longing that Luke begins his story. He introduces us to an elderly couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth. Zechariah was a priest, a man who served in the very temple in Jerusalem, the heart of Israel's worship. Luke tells us they were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. They were faithful people living according to the very laws we read about in Deuteronomy. But their lives were marked by a deep sadness. They had no children, and Elizabeth was considered barren. In their culture, this was a source of great shame and sorrow. It was often seen as a sign of God's displeasure. Yet, they continued to serve God faithfully. One day, while Zechariah was performing his priestly duties in the temple, something extraordinary happened. The angel Gabriel appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. Zechariah was terrified, as anyone would be when faced with a messenger from heaven. The angel's first words were meant to calm him. "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard." Gabriel brought incredible news. Despite their old age, Elizabeth would have a son, and they were to name him John. This would be no ordinary child. The angel said he would be great in the sight of the Lord, and would be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he was born. His mission would be to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. He would be a prophet like the great Elijah of old, turning the hearts of the people back to God and preparing the way for the arrival of the Lord himself. This was the moment Israel had been waiting for, the fulfillment of prophecy spoken long ago. Zechariah, a man steeped in a lifetime of religious service, found this news hard to believe. He questioned the angel, asking, "How can I be sure of this? I am an old man, and my wife is well along in years." His faith wavered in the face of the miraculous. Because of his doubt, the angel told him he would be silent, unable to speak, until the day the child was born. When Zechariah came out of the temple, the waiting crowd knew something had happened because he couldn't speak to them. He had encountered God, and it had left him speechless, a silent witness to a promise that was too wonderful for words. 6 months after his visit to Zechariah, the same angel Gabriel was sent on another mission. This time, he didn't go to the Grand Temple in Jerusalem or to an important priest. He went to a small, insignificant town called Nazareth in the region of Galilee. He appeared to a young woman named Mary, who was engaged to be married to a carpenter named Joseph. Mary was not old and respected like Elizabeth. She was young, poor, and unknown. Gabriel's greeting was astonishing. "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Mary was confused and troubled by these words, wondering what they could possibly mean for a simple girl like her. The angel then delivered the most world-changing message ever spoken. He told Mary not to be afraid. She had found favor with God and would conceive and give birth to a son, and she was to call him Jesus. This child, the angel explained, would be great and would be called the Son of the Most High. God would give him the throne of his ancestor David, and he would reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom would never end. This was the promise of the Messiah, the long-awaited king who would rescue Israel and establish God's perfect rule on earth. Like Zechariah, Mary had a question, but her question was different. It was not a question of doubt, but of practical wonder. "How will this be?" she asked, "since I am a virgin?" She wasn't questioning if God could do it, she was asking how it would happen. The angel explained that this would be a unique and miraculous work of God. The Holy Spirit would come upon her, and the power of the Most High would overshadow her. Therefore, the Holy One to be born would be called the Son of God. To help her believe, the angel also told her the news about her relative Elizabeth, who was already 6 months pregnant in her old age, for no word from God will ever fail. Faced with this incredible, life-altering and potentially dangerous news, this young woman responded with remarkable faith and courage. Her answer has echoed through the centuries as a perfect model of trust in God. She said, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled." She said yes to God. She placed her life, her reputation, and her future completely in God's hands. Where the old priest in the holy temple had hesitated, the young girl in the humble village believed. Her faith opened the door for God to begin his greatest work of rescue and renewal for the whole world. After the angel's visit, Mary hurried to the hill country to visit her relative Elizabeth. The meeting of these two women, one old and one young, both carrying miracle babies, is one of the most beautiful moments in the Bible. As soon as Mary's greeting reached Elizabeth's ears, the baby in Elizabeth's womb, John, leaped for joy. Elizabeth herself was filled with the Holy Spirit and cried out in a loud voice, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear." She understood immediately the significance of Mary's visit, calling her the mother of my Lord. Elizabeth celebrated Mary's faith, saying, "Blessed is she who has believed that the Lord would fulfill his promises to her." In response to Elizabeth's blessing, Mary breaks into a song of praise, known as the Magnificat. This song is not just a personal expression of joy, it is a powerful declaration of what God is doing in the world through her and her son, Jesus. Her song is filled with echoes of the Old Testament, particularly the song of Hannah, another woman who received a miracle child. Mary praises God because he, the Mighty One, has done great things for her. She celebrates that God has noticed her, a humble servant girl, showing that God's favor is not for the powerful and proud, but for the lowly. Mary's song then broadens from her personal experience to God's work in all of history. She sings about a great reversal that is taking place. God is scattering the proud, bringing down rulers from their thrones, but lifting up the humble. He is filling the hungry with good things, but sending the rich away empty. This is the world turned upside down, or rather, turned right side up according to God's values. The birth of Jesus marks the beginning of a new kingdom, where the world's standards of power, wealth, and importance are completely overthrown by God's standards of mercy, justice, and love. Finally, Mary's song connects this new thing God is doing directly back to the ancient promises. She sings that God is helping his servant Israel, remembering to be merciful to Abraham and his descendants forever, just as he promised our ancestors. Mary understood that the birth of Jesus was not a random event. It was the fulfillment of the promises that God had been making for centuries. The hope that began with Abraham, that was guided by the laws of Moses in Deuteronomy, and that was longed for by generations of faithful people, was now coming to pass. The long wait was over. God was keeping his word. When we place the ancient laws of Deuteronomy next to the miraculous beginnings in Luke, we see the beautiful, consistent story of God's heart for humanity. The rules in Deuteronomy about returning a lost ox or building a safe roof were never just about rules. They were about cultivating a heart of compassion, justice, and care for one's neighbor. They were God's way of teaching his people, in very practical terms, what love looks like. These laws were a blueprint for a community that reflected God's own character, a community where the vulnerable were protected, life was respected, and everyone was responsible for the well-being of others. The stories in Luke 1 show this divine love in action, bursting into the world in a new and powerful way. God's care is seen in his remembrance of a righteous, childless couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth. He lifts the shame from them and gives them a son who will be a herald of hope. God's care is seen even more profoundly in his choice of Mary, a humble young woman from a forgotten town. The great reversal that Mary sings about, the proud being scattered, the humble being lifted up, is the very principle of justice that Deuteronomy was aiming for. God is building his true community, not with the powerful, but with those who have faithful and open hearts. The connection is profound. The kindness commanded in Deuteronomy finds its ultimate expression in the God who becomes human in Jesus. The hope for a just society, outlined in the law, begins to be realized in the kingdom that Jesus will bring. The faith required to follow God's laws, even when they were difficult, is mirrored in the stunning faith of Mary, who said yes to God's impossible plan. The ancient laws were like signposts pointing the way, while the birth of Jesus is the arrival at the destination. The rules showed the shadow of God's goodness. Jesus is the substance. For us today, living in 2025, these ancient texts are not just historical documents, they are a guide and an inspiration. Deuteronomy challenges us to look at the practical ways we can build communities of care. Are we looking out for our neighbors? Are we creating safe spaces? Are we concerned with justice for the vulnerable? Luke's gospel fills us with hope, reminding us that God is always at work, often in surprising and unexpected ways through ordinary people. He reminds us that faith, like Mary's, can open the door for God to do incredible things. Together, these two books call us to live lives of practical kindness, fueled by a living hope in the God who keeps his promises.